Give it another 30 seconds or a minute, and then we will begin. All right, let's get started. Welcome back if you were here last week. My name is Mary Najimy. I am the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, here with Max Page. Max, you want to say hi so people can identify you?
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
And you see we have a whole series of panelists who are very own MTA members. I will introduce them as they come to the part that they will be facilitating. We're also lucky we will be joined by a special guest from out of state and a parent. Max and I will get the agenda started as soon as we hear from Jess Hemens, who's going to go through some Zoom protocol for today's meeting.
Thanks so much, Mary. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. If you have not done so already, we'd like to know who you are. Please don't use a nickname. Please use your first and last name. If you need to change it, just hover over your name, click rename, and you can do that for us. Everybody is muted during this meeting. Please acknowledge any challenges of conducting such a large meeting through a virtual platform. Treat each other with respect and have patience. We will be doing 3 polls today. It's going to pop up on your screen. It's a yes, no. We'll probably give you about a minute to fill it out. It is anonymous, so please answer honestly. I will show the results after we are done with each one. We do want to acknowledge that some people aren't able to access the poll, and we're sorry about that. Zoom does have some limitations. One way you can try to troubleshoot that is that we do ask that people get on this webinar through their computer and use the app. If you're trying to use it through the Zoom browser, sometimes your pop-ups are disabled. So that could be causing it. Otherwise, you could also try to close your chat and see if you see it at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical issues or you want more information, please email mtagovernance@massteachers.org, not the chat. And back to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Just one more reminder. I want to note that MTA is recording this session, but MTA members are not allowed to record without the consent of the MTA. So we're going to ask you please not to do that, and we will post all that we have online. So let's get started. Nobody would have imagined that none of us were going to get a real summer. You all, be it leaders, bargaining team members, CAT team members, activists, members, have been taxed and pushed to the limits in circumstances that we couldn't have imagined. And we're almost near the start of the year. But there's always good news. And Max and I feel like it's so important to start with victories and wins, because the hard work you are doing is really paying off. Here's one way that it's paying off. The headlines in the Boston Globe last week said the tide is turning. Who's turning that tide? And what is that tide? The tide of how we're going to start virtually is turning, and it's been turned by you. We are winning in many, many cities and towns across Massachusetts. School committee votes that believe the teachers have it right. We need to start virtually. That also includes some UMass Amherst, the UMass Amherst and UMass Lowell campuses. They've taken our advice. It isn't safe to bring college students back on campuses, and so they're starting virtually. Max, tell us what else we're winning.
All right. Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everyone. And, just to underscore what Mary said is, look, there's a lot of fear out there. We're all feeling that. That's why there's thousands and thousands of people joining on these calls. And fear can be exacerbated by isolation and loneliness, and that's where the union comes in, your local as well as the 117,000 members of the MTA. And we are mighty, and as Mary said, we're winning. So let's go talk about one of those. So 2 weeks ago, many of you were on this first large membership call of some 8,000 members, and you sent thousands of emails and texts and made calls to legislators demanding that they provide clarity on funding for public education, pre-K through higher ed. So you all did that during the meeting. So 2 days later, this is how the legislature responded. They passed a budget that level funds the entire state budget through October. For higher ed, which had been threatened with 10, 20% cuts, that at least means there's level funding through October with the kind of commitment that would go on for the rest of the year. So that's really important for higher ed. It's not what everything they wanted at all, but it's at least a step. For K-12 schools, it went even further. Even though the state budget's going on for 4 months, you all won a commitment from the legislature that every single district will have at least as much money as last year. Many districts will also get some additional funds, especially those districts that have been most deprived of resources, but everyone will have at least as much money as last year. And we have, I think a link is going up in the chat. Dave Danning from our Center for Education Policy and Practice put together a pretty clear spreadsheet. So each of you can see what your district is getting in Chapter 70 monies. That's the main funding from the state for public schools. What you're getting from the state, as well as what you're getting in terms of federal funding. That's the baseline. But that should be really clear. And what we want you to have this knowledge for is to be able to go back to school committees and superintendents who may still have layoffs that they're keeping on, layoffs made back in June, over 2,000 of our members. You can go back to them and say, the money is there now. The money is at least as much as last year. You need to hire back all those people and don't talk to us about those cuts. We need more educators, not fewer. So that is really crucial. It is not all we wanted. We want the full Student Opportunity Act funds, and that's what we're going to be fighting for. But what you all did in that outpouring, which the legislature heard, they were kind of stunned by how many emails and calls they got in a very short order. What you got was at least a kind of a level funding, a commitment to keep the funding up for K-12 schools.
I'm going to give you 2 more numbers. Max gave you thousands. I'm going to start with a small one, and then I'm going to give you a larger one. 10. 10 is the number of days that we got the state to concede for educators to have planning time before instruction resumes. And you did it the same way Max just described how you did it for winning the funding. We had meetings. We had a general membership meeting, and we had a caucus meeting, and we asked people to stop and pick up their phones and turn on their computers and blast the Department of Education to say, we need 10 days of planning time to redesign learning under COVID education. And the very next day, we got it. Here's a bigger number, 2,605 to be precise. That is the number of letters that you sent to the legislature telling your feelings about MCAS and telling them that they have to support the bill that Joe Comerford just submitted to the State House. That's a huge number. That's going to be a big fight. That is the linchpin of the ed reformers, and they are going to hold on to that tooth and nail. But we got rid of MCAS last March. We still have a fight ahead of us to get rid of it for this March. But that's an incredible feat. Max has even more numbers that are even more hopeful.
All right, thanks, Mary. So I'm actually going to ask Jess if you could put on the screen a series of slides. We decided on a pathway as a union, you as locals, and then we as a statewide, that we needed to push for a remote start, a phased reopening, that it was not safe for educators or students and their families. That's a decision we made based on our own instincts, our own knowledge, conversations. But then we decided after that, let's check out what the general public thinks about that. It's good to know where you stand with the general public. So here's a poll we took, again, general public, not educators. And what you see is, on the top, you can see, and I've summarized the numbers. You don't have to look at all those kind of pie chart numbers, but look at these numbers. Parents are incredibly concerned about their children catching the coronavirus, and they're also concerned about family members. Below, all voters, so it's not just parents, it's all voters, are almost equally concerned about children and teachers and educators to be that they will catch the disease. I mean, these numbers are unbelievable. This is almost universal, right? 9 out of 10 people who are asked are in some way concerned about this. So that means they are absolutely in line with us. Let's go to the next slide, Jess. It's just, this is also, we asked about colleges and universities. You can see 9 out of 10, both parents and all voters are very concerned about students on colleges and universities catching the disease. Go ahead to the next one. So we asked some questions like, which statements do you agree with? You can see 71% agreed with the statement on the right. We should not be confident opening the schools for all students in the fall. We don't fully understand the disease, and while some studies suggest the transmission is low in schools, newer studies show children of a certain age may be as likely as adults to spread the virus. 71% are on that side. Again, alongside us of expressing our concerns about the safety of schools. Go on to the next one. So again, another thing where we have on the left side and the right side, two different statements. You can see the combined support very strongly and strongly on the right side is 78%. Let's have a flexible approach in which remote learning is improved and applied in the beginning of the school year. Then some students are moved back into schools if coronavirus cases remain low and as health and safety standards are put in place. This is exactly what we have together in your locals and statewide put forward. Let's have a phased approach. Let's start remotely. 78%, again, overwhelming numbers of support in the general public. Go ahead to the next slide, thanks. Another way of asking the same thing, 84% support either public schools should open with a phased approach using remote teaching, then slowly introducing in-person classes as we learn more, or as you see, 25% to say, hey, just remain closed and students should continue with remote learning. Again, 84%, these are like off the charts positive. You get 60% support, that's great. When we're up to 84, 90%, it shows how aligned the general public is with you all as educators. Go ahead to the next one. We asked a couple other questions. Mary just highlighted the outpouring you all provided in support of a moratorium on the MCAS. Well, 68% support having a moratorium, at least no MCAS this coming year. And you can see above as well, most supported what we fought for, which is being flexible, lessening the 180-day school day requirement. All right, one last one. And this is another question we asked, building off of our original set of demands that we put before DESE that many of you ratified in your locals. We said, when we come back, we need to change the curriculum as well. And look at this question. Do you think our public schools should include a curriculum addressing issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, including systemic racism? This is, to my mind, remarkable in a state that has had a very troublesome history of systemic racism. For this many people in the general public to say, yes, we need to discuss these issues, including systemic racism, in our public schools. This, I think, should give us some hope about changing the direction of our curriculum. The last thing I'll say is just to underscore the whole point here, which is we took all action in your locals, statewide, and the public is with us. You may hear people saying, oh, well, the parents really want to go back. It's the teachers union that's against it. It's just simply false. Parents, as well as general voters, are with us. And the reason they're with us is because they trust you. They trust educators on education issues so far above everyone else. It's incredible. I mean, 3 or 4 times the trust level they have in DESE, 10 times the trust level they have in the state legislature. You all have this incredibly valuable tool that you've built up over years, which is the trust people have in your views about public education. All right, thanks. Back to you, Mary.
Thanks, Max. I just want to re-emphasize how we are winning. We are winning and why we are winning. Because we, since March, as the MTA, have pulled together a statewide campaign in a way that we've never done before. This one issue is the issue that impacts each and every single one of you in a way that was is far beyond how charter schools in question 2 impacted us, and even how school funding impacted us. No one is safe from this virus. And if people didn't before understand what it meant to be a member of the MTA, they sure get it now. You're feeling your power because you are connected to us as an institution and to each other. And what has happened in over 90 of our locals is the membership and the leadership have passed resolutions saying they support the position of starting virtually. And as a result, many of those 90 school committees, and some of the school committees whose locals haven't finished the work passing that position, have also taken that position. And you know we're winning when the boss tries to fight back. And who's the boss in this case? The Department of Education and the governor. Look what they did this week. The governor created a map, and let's not lose sight of the implicit racism in his map when he decides to use the color white to mark the communities that are safe. Predominantly, those are the white communities. And we have Mary Grutchfield, who's the president of Athol. She's going to be speaking later to actually tell you what really happens no matter what your community is. The commissioner is using the map to say these are the communities that we expect to open fully. These are the communities that we expect to start with a hybrid, and these are the 2 communities that we expect, or 3, a handful of communities are the only ones who can start remotely. That's pushback to us, and it comes at the last minute because he's desperate. He is losing this fight to the parents and the students and the educators. And like Max said, there's some reporting that's starting that parents aren't with us. There's a group called Bring the Kids Back, and they had a rally yesterday of 25 people compared to the 100,000 that we have with us. So let's not be frightened by the headlines, and let's harness the anger that we have about what the commissioner and the governor are doing to us to keep moving, because the fight isn't over yet. There are still places where school committees have voted on a hybrid. Don't get deflated and don't get defeated by that, because we're going to talk later today about how we keep pushing. No decision is final until it's final. And we're going to make it final, and we're going to make it different. You know, Max said parents are with us, and they are. Being with us is a little different, though, than being in relationship with us. And there's parents who have different levels of privilege, and we relate to them differently. There are parents from middle income and high income families who are with us or are not sure, because everybody's torn about what is really going to happen to our students in a virtual learning model. Well, first of all, we have to tell them we're not going back to that model. That didn't work. We're going to redesign it. But we also have to be in relationship with them to ask them, how did it work? How do we need to redesign it? Let me tell you what it would be like if your kids came back. If I had to open my kindergarten class, the block area, the art table, the sand table, the dress up corner would be closed. We couldn't share blocks. We probably couldn't even use counters for math and magnetic letters to learn the alphabet. It would be it would not be the experience that I would want my 5-year-olds to have as their first experience of school. And the experience of coming back into the buildings the way we would have to be is not the experience that we want our students to have, no matter how many years they've been in school. And then there's families of lower income, families of color, families who are English learners or don't speak English at all. And we have to really think about them. They are with us in higher numbers statistically because they are at higher risk. We do recognize that this is a public health issue for all, and therefore it is a common good issue, but we can't lose sight of the nearly 390,000 of our students who are counted under SOA, the Student Opportunity Act, as living at 185% of the poverty level. That is almost a third of Massachusetts students, and many of them are in your classrooms. And some of them come from low-income white families. Some of them come from families of color. Some of them are special education students. Some of them are our English learners. And those are the families who we really have to redefine and redevelop permanent relationships where we're real partners. And I've brought Zena Link, who is one of our strong activists, MTA member. She's going to talk to you about the importance of how to think about working with our vulnerable communities. And after that, Nellie Medina, who's one of our parent organizers with the Meja Coalition in Worcester, she's going to talk more specifically about how our most vulnerable parents are thinking, what they need, and how we relate to them. Welcome, Zena Link. Zena, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about community and parents working together for education. And it was in the 70s in which parent and family and school partnerships became very popular. And with those relationships, in fact, there was funding that was available, and it was actually embedded in most school systems. But what happened was as parents were involved with the schools, they were also starting to challenge some of the structural and systemic inequities that the school system itself was inflicting onto their communities. And so it was in 1982 that the Reagan administration eliminated parental involvement as part of the Title I legislation. And that actually changed the dynamics between school and parent relationships. And it also grew a level of untrust because parents didn't feel like their voices were actually validated, and that the very policies and practices and procedures within the school systems were the same things that were causing the communities the most harm. And so what has happened and continues to happen is that the community has actually never left the schools. They still have this level of involvement and concern, but the school system has told educators that they can't communicate with parents in the community in the same way, even though it was proven quite effective for many, many years. And so now what the challenge is that when society, we're in this interesting point right now in the world where society is kind of more open and aware about the role of public education in systemic and structural inequities in our society. And they are willing to advocate and support education in ways that they haven't before. And so the challenge for the communities is that how do we build these family and school partnerships that has this shared voice that requires parental involvement and builds trust between the schools and the families, particularly the educators, and that educators begin to understand and are willing to engage families that don't share the same worldviews, culture, and or lived experience, but are greatly impacted and affected by the structure of education policies that are enforced by the school system. I've had the pleasure to work with a group called WAJA, which is the Worcester Education Justice Alliance. And we're a consortium of parents, family, students, and community members. And I want to introduce Nellie Medina, who is also a parent as well as an active community member who has been working with WAJA. Nellie?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Zena. Thank you all for inviting me here for this important topic. So we work for education justice in Worcester, which has been a problem for decades. Back in the 60s, where students who spoke Spanish were put into special ed. And so once they implemented the ELL, they put more cops in our schools and took away our counselors. So we have the bilingual consent decree, and then we have more cops in our schools. If parents do not organize, we'll lose what we gained. And it's important for us to fight along with educators to equalize the struggles that we have in our schools. We're underfunded for years, and now the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to keep the most marginalized communities in starvation mode. And as a leader and as a public voice for the families that entrust me with their stories, I promise you that we are concerned with where the funding for the Student Opportunity Act will go. We're demanding that Destiny put our families and community and people before profit. And we're saddened that our city council members and Worcester School Committee will not step into the gap for our children and educators. In addition to ELL, now we demand that education and emphasis be put on the Black Lives Matter movement. We are working with under 2% capacity. Our food banks are 200% over capacity. We have a large immigrant community who is largely underrepresented. It's really important, I think, at this point to continue as an organizer to fight. The only way we get anything done is with community involvement. And I agree with Zena Link that Title I was created to keep the families out, but we are resilient. We keep fighting, and we do what we have to do in order to be heard. The COVID-19 crisis has really destabilized us. We're going to fight along with educators and stakeholders to make this hybrid model just an idea. I don't think our students should go back, and us marginalized communities are not a control group, and we shouldn't be seen as such.
Thank you, Nellie.
Thank you.
Zena named it. Zena told an untold history that we're not really familiar with. And Zena named it when she said the administrators are telling us we shouldn't talk to parents. How many of you have heard that? Of course, they want us to talk to parents. They want us to talk to parents during parent conferences, or when a child fell down and scraped his knee, right? Or when a student had an amazing moment and performed incredibly in an exciting way to share. What they don't want us to talk to parents about is the reality of the schools that we deserve and the schools that we're fighting for. But let's disabuse ourselves of that notion. As union members, it is our right. As educators, it's our obligation. And especially if it is a union organized activity, it's protected. The administration can't say to unionized educators acting in a union capacity that you can't talk to parents. And yet sometimes it's hard because sometimes we just don't know what to say or how to start the conversation. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and think about this past school year or the year before, some recent school year. Can you think of a parent, just one parent, that you have a trusting relationship with, that you would be willing to have the conversation about returning to school? So let's put up a poll. We're going to take a poll to see if you have one parent you would feel comfortable reaching out to. And you don't have to know exactly what you want to say, but let's just start identifying, is there at least one? All right, we'll keep the poll open for about another 5 or 10 seconds. It's starting to slow down. All right, so we've closed the poll. Look at that. Almost 1,000 of you have one parent that you would be willing to talk to. And for the several hundred who are not sure, you don't have to know right now. Keep thinking. Is there a parent of whom you've had multiple children? Is there a parent that you have friendly conversations with in passing at drop-off or pickup? Is there a parent, if you have the privilege of parents having time to volunteer in your classroom, that volunteers in your classroom? Be thinking about this, because then I want to ask you a second question related to that. if we're going to ask you to start conversations with parents, we also have an obligation to help you learn how to do that. So would you be interested in attending a workshop about building community labor partnerships with families? Keep it open for about 10 or 12 more seconds because the numbers are slowing down. All right, look at that, similar numbers. We've got nearly 1,000 of you who would be willing. We had similar numbers yesterday, and boy, is MTA gonna have their hands full trying to find Zoom spaces for a couple thousand people, but that's a good problem to have. So we will be in touch with you as we design these things, and we're hoping to design some of these workshops for you very soon. So parents are with us, and we have an obligation to stand in solidarity with each other, including our educators of color. I'd like to introduce Sarah McLaughlin, who is an activist with our Alana Educator Network, and she's going to talk to you about what they've been up to and the solidarity that educators of color need from the rest of us.
Hi, and good morning. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay, hello. I'm happy to be here with you at this virtual meeting. My name is Sarah McLaughlin. I'm an 8th grade science teacher at Melrose Public Schools. I'm also a member of the statewide Alana Network. Alana is made up of educators of color from across the state that represents K through 12 and higher ed. It is my pleasure to share with you some of our views on race in education. During this pandemic, teachers have said to me, this is not the time to talk about race. We need to focus on the reopening of schools only. However, an Alana member would say, yes, we can do that, but more importantly, let's start looking at how teaching can change. COVID-19 has given us a chance to reimagine what education looks like, as well as how and what we teach. Instead of shutting down conversations that challenge the status quo, let's be open to new possibilities. Imagine schools could be more financially invested. We could create schools that demonstrate genuine care for and the values of students of color by having systems and structures in place that increase attention to social, emotional well-being and de-emphasize high-stakes testing. This will support students of color and allow them to feel seen. Imagine schools where diversity of the staff reflects the diversity of the students in front of them. Imagine schools where educators of color feel supported and heard by their colleagues and administrators. Imagine a school where every person feels welcome, seen, and safe. These types of schools are possible when educational systems recognize the needs of Black and Brown students and commit to dismantling systemic racism from within. One way we can do this is if we all reimagine our schools, a place where all voices are heard and represented. Let's take a math class as an example. And just for the record, I love math and math teachers are awesome. But I have heard throughout the time, for example, math teachers saying they cannot make race and social justice issues a part of their classroom. This is simply not true. Sure, math is full of numbers and equations, but is also a subject full of wonder, problems, and projects that can be looked at through different lenses. Those questions and problems can include your student's voice. As educators, we need to ask ourselves, who is benefiting from these lessons, discussions, and assessments? If we can't respond to that simple question by saying our students are benefiting, then we are doing something wrong. Let's be sure that every student is heard and represented. Thank you for your time, and let's reimagine our schools together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's another piece of work that MTA is working towards. We're going to hear from Murph Brown later, our Director of Training and Professional Learning. But this is where, through the MTA, is where we learn how to transform our curriculum. I'd like to introduce Joe Bouquet, because not only are parents with us, but there's some important officials, elected officials, who are with us too. And Joe Bouquet, who's also with our Alana Educator Network, is going to tell you about who else stands with us. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Joe Bouquet, I teach 4th grade in Brookline, and I'm also a member of the Alana Educator Network. I'm actually really thrilled to share that another important figure stands with the position that the MTA took. This is our very own Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Just a few weeks ago, she wrote a press release agreeing that any decision on how to approach the upcoming school year must center the voices of those most impacted. That's our students, educators, and their families. Ultimately, she asserts that the safety and health of our children, educators, and community must come first, and that we must begin the school year with fully remote instruction. So it's really just thrilling to have her support, and if you'd like to check out her whole message, it's going to be dropped into the chat.
And what you see in front of you is a screenshot of her website. Look at that. She names us. Thank you, Joe. There are some people who aren't with us yet. Some of your school committees aren't with us and the families. The Commissioner of Education and the Governor. The MTA took a position last weekend that we are going to do something about it. We need to start getting in touch with the Governor. Before we do, I'm going to ask Will, it's a mouthful, Carvanaris, who is the co-chair of one of our North of Boston networks, to actually lay out the picture of both how well it's going, but some bumps in the road that they're having in North of Boston.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Will Carvanaris, and I'm the proud president of the Wakefield Education Association. Earlier this year, my colleague in Gloucester, Cynthia Carney, and I decided to unite the presidents of the North Shore in an effort to demonstrate our power. Our collective power in the North Shore was titled NOBEAM, the North of Boston Educator Action Network. Fast forward a few months, we drafted a letter demanding a phased-in reopening approach. That phased-in approach would start each district remotely and then gradually add small groups of students after reviewing updated health and safety data. Word spread so fast about this letter that locals outside of the North of Boston region were asking to endorse our letter. That letter has now been signed by more than 40 locals and represents more than 15,000 proud MTA members. And we continue to receive requests to add signatories to the letter. From Gloucester to Everett, from Wakefield to Belmont, from Danvers to Malden, we have never had more power as a regional association. But our work is not done. This is exactly why we still have to act together. Some brief updates from last week and this week. 2 nights ago, Melrose voted to start remotely through October 16th. Manchester Essex voted to start the school year remotely. Beverly is starting remotely in grades 7 through 12. Swampscott is starting remotely through late October. Malden has voted to start remotely until it's safe to open our schools. And last night, Wakefield voted to start remotely through the end of September. But that's just the start. I don't know what would have happened if we didn't unite our superpowers, but I do know that our school committees and superintendents have heard us loudly and clearly. We still have a lot of work to do, though, but I'm so proud of the connections that have been made over the past few months. So we met this morning as North of Boston, and Mary's going to talk about some possible actions next week.
That's right. And I'm going to ask Sarah McLaughlin to take 60 seconds or so to actually tell how they use their superpowers in one of the districts that Will just named, Melrose. They finally turned up the heat, and they got their school committee to come around. And you can do this too. Sarah, take it away,
Yeah.
60 seconds.
60 seconds. Again, I'm Sarah McLaughlin, and I'm really thrilled to be talking about being a part of the NOBEAM, as well as my contract action team. So a contract action team is voicing our support for our negotiation team, and it makes it open and transparent where educators stand. We all want to return to school, but only when it's safe. And how do you have that message seen and heard is you must use your educator's voice. You must be clear with your position and with your words and actions. Our superintendent and some of our school committee got moved by our actions and our words. And it not only did that, but it brought our union that was a little quiet a lot louder and our voices were heard. To see more of our actions of what we did, I do welcome you to look at our Facebook and Twitter info, because I'd love for you to see our story and our movement. And I would like, if you'd like, you can also reach out personally to us through searching, if you go to the MTA website through and search in Melrose. It really does work. Your teachers' voices need to be heard, and your positions and your actions do matter, because it definitely moved from a vote of 5 for remote to 2, and it's because we made sure it was clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. They actually projected the school committee meeting publicly on the walls of the school outside. So we're going to ask you to use your superpowers right now. The MTA took a position that we as a board are going to send a letter to the governor. And yesterday we stopped in the meeting with 4,000 people, and we asked you to make a phone call, and we asked you to send an email. And here's the basic message. We need the governor to do his part and call for all schools to begin virtually until the following 3 standards can be met. Every building needs to be inspected. The ventilation systems must be upgraded so that air quality can meet industry standards. We need to have community transmission levels set and met. None of this nonsense that he just put out. And we have to have rapid testing and tracing available and free and consistent in every single school. Not if one of those things is missing, then it's not safe to return. They work like gears in a system. When one of them doesn't turn, the system doesn't work. So we're going to stop and we're going to pause. Here's a script if you'd like to follow. The phone number is on the screen. We will also we just put in the chat the script. And I believe that there's an email address that we can put in the chat as well. Many of you have done enough with environmental health and safety through the MTA that you might have a real clear sense already of what you want to say. If you're new to this, feel free to use this script or to modify it in a way that fits. So let's take 3 minutes. Let's make the call. Let's send the email. And then we'll open the chat in a couple of minutes, and you can post in the chat how it went. Okay, we'll give it about 30 more seconds. We'll open the chat, and if you would like to post, just quickly tell us how it just went. Great, a lot of people are taking action. I believe we also have this posted as an action alert on our social media. And if you would like later to scroll back up and copy and paste the script and the number and save it, and ask your friends and families to do it too. Ask your other union members to do it as well. So now I am pleased to turn to you, somebody who's special to the MTA, Eric Blank. He is an activist, a researcher, an author. He came to speak to us 2 years ago at summer conference. He wrote a book called Red State Revolts. And Eric is here to give us a little bit of a pep talk and help us understand exactly where MTA is in the context of what's happening around the country for the fight for public education. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to be on the call with you all. The work MTA is doing is really inspiring to me, and I think to educators across the country. I was asked to give a pep talk, and I was thinking, you know, what would be inspirational, but also factually accurate. And so what I thought as a way of starting off would be to say, look at what our enemies are saying about us, to get a sense of our own power. Because what the argument I want to make is that actually educators in Massachusetts and across the country do have the power to win, not just to keep schools safe, but to actually win the kind of schools we need. But we underestimate that. And I think that sometimes it's good to see what our opponents are saying. So I'm going to pull up the video, put it on screen share. 1 second. Okay, here we go. So to get a sense of that, it's loading. Here we go. This is a op-ed from the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago called "Will Unions Let Schools Reopen? Emboldened by successful strikes in 2018 and 2019, they may attempt to hold the economy hostage." And so these were the two big quotes that I thought were really useful to think about. This is what they say. "The reopening of public schools poses an economic conundrum. If the schools aren't open, many parents will lack childcare and will be unable to return to work. Parents can't work, the economy can't recover. Teachers' unions are thus in a position to hold the economy hostage." So I don't really, I wouldn't use the hostage terminology, but there is a big point there, which is that educators across the country right now have a tremendous amount of leverage because the economy can't get up and running until we essentially determine that it's safe to go back. And so that does give us the ability not just to set the conditions for when to return, but what kind of schools we need when we return. Because as we know, and as you know, we can't just return to the status quo, which was broken, which was racially unjust. And that raises the question then of how to tie these fights together. And so looking at the next quote, it says, "Expect the unions to push back. Emboldened by successful strikes in 2018 and 2019, they appear to be in a strong position." And then it goes on to give some examples of what that looks like. And I think this is true. The strike upsurge since 2018 really has set a different context for the educators movement. We're in the midst of the biggest educators upsurge in the history of this country. So to give you a sense of that, this is a graph that shows the number of educators on strike going back to the 90s, but it looks the same if you go back even further. In 2018, you just see this exponential rise in educators that have struck. And these strikes not only won a lot of important gains, funding, better pay, things like that, but it changed the public narrative. So much so that this was Time magazine covers not very long ago, 2014, "Rotten Apples. It's nearly impossible to fire a bad teacher. Some tech millionaires may have found a way to change that." And then all of a sudden, with the mass mobilizations we saw in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, then after that in Chicago, Los Angeles, you start seeing covers like this more recently in time. I have a master's degree, 16 years of experience, work 2 extra jobs, and donate blood plasma to pay the bills. I am a teacher in America. So because of that, it means that we've actually are in a situation now where overwhelmingly the public trusts teachers, and they understand that the crisis in our schools in general has to do with underfunding, not what used to be said, which is like the public sector is bad, teachers unions are bad. And so that is very clearly the case now when you look at who parents trust when it comes to reopening schools, despite all of the pressure from above, from Republicans, from some corporate Democrats, from billionaires. The polls are clear. Most parents are wary of returning to school buildings before it's safe. And that's especially the case for Black and Latino communities. And in that sense, the fight, as you've already talked about, for safe schools is not just a fight, for the health of everybody, but it's in particular a racial justice fight, because the communities that are going to suffer the most through premature reopening are communities of color. So I think then the question is posed, what is the reason, why is it that educators have power to win? And what are some of the lessons maybe we could take from the 2018 red state strikes? And so the first thing I would highlight emanates, if you look from this graph, you can see that the number of educators on strike, actually number of total workers per strike in 2018 was by far the highest in the history of this country. And the reason for that is that those were statewide movements. And so that's the point I want to really focus on right now, is that the reason those actions were so successful is that they were statewide. And that really goes against a lot of the, pressure in education to focus on just district by district struggles, even though so much of the power is on a state and federal level. And so when you look at West Virginia, the famous slogan they came up with was 55 United, which referred to the 55 counties all united. And I think it's very likely that it's going to take that type of ethos today, that we're all in it together if we're going to win. Because as you know, the politicians right now are trying to pit different districts against each other, making some go back and others are allowed to return at a different time. And what that is doing is trying to fracture us, keep us divided so that we can't have a unified front against their plans. And that means that we're less likely to win. But when we saw in Oklahoma and Arizona and elsewhere, is that educators said, we're not going to go back, we're not going to stop fighting until all of us have won, right? Because we're only so strong as the weakest link. And so I think that is worth thinking about how that can be operationalized today. The next thing I would highlight is that if you look at Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, they were able to win in such a difficult context. And I think in some ways that's very inspirational, hopefully, for the organizing you're doing in Massachusetts, because, for instance, the vast majority of educators were not even unionized in these states. And nevertheless, they were able to take on some of the most reactionary governments and win. And so if you compare that to the MTA and to Massachusetts, I'm really inspired by the depth of organization that MTA has been, putting into practice for these last years. Even just this call, we had another call yesterday, thousands of educators on the line. And that doesn't come out of nowhere. That comes out of years of transforming your union, building up rank and file capacity, reaching out to communities, members. The reality is not all unions across the country are like that. And I don't want to say anything more mean than that, but MTA is really special. And I think, it's really an honor for me to be on this call, but it's also just worth reflecting on your part that you have an opportunity and in some ways maybe a responsibility to win it, not just for educators in Massachusetts, but for all across the country, because the depth of your organization means that you have the ability, I think, if you get organized, if you keep on fighting, to not only change the trajectory in your state, but set the type of example that educators across the country are looking for right now, because so many people realize there's problems, realize that they need to fight back to keep the schools from opening prematurely, but they need an example for what it looks like to fight back and win. And I think that at this moment, MTA is really well positioned to play the kind of role for national inspiration that West Virginia played in 2018, that Los Angeles played in 2019. And I'm really honored to be here with you and to see all of the work that you're doing. over the next couple of days and weeks, and look to try to uplift your victories when they come. Thanks so much. I'm gonna end the stop share now, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Eric. Eric is spot on. This is about the statewide connections, the statewide solidarity. And what's coming up in the chat is the same thing that came up yesterday. There's still two fundamental problems. One fundamental problem is some school committees are voting to start hybrid, and the other fundamental problem is some school committees voted to start virtually, but they're trying to send you into the buildings. It's not over yet. Like I said, it isn't over till it's over. So we need to kick it up to the next notch, and that's August 19th. We have 4, possibly 5 central locations where we are acting as one, dispersed across the state, but it's one union and one message, and the message is only when it's safe. Here's what's happening in Boston. We haven't picked the time yet. We think it's going to be early afternoon, perhaps 3 o'clock. Funeral procession around the State House, driving the parade route that we did for the Fund Our Future rally. It literally takes us in a square around the State House. Simultaneously, we're asking educators to do a 6-foot standout of 6-foot social distancing, but bring a paper chain that's 6 feet long. And that paper chain represents the number of lives that won't be lost if we start virtually, if we all start virtually. Not kids starting virtually and educators in the building. Everybody starts virtually. The plans are still in the works, but there could be a third action in the same place. That paper chain, by the way, we will line Beacon Street from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill. And if we have more than that, we will go down the street even further. Out in Western Mass, along Route 5 from West Springfield to Northampton, they're doing the same thing with the paper chains. The Cape and Islands have 15 points of actions, and we are going to put the link in the chat to the Facebook page for that. It's at every Rotary and certain town squares. And there's some development that is happening sort of central north Route 2. All of this will be determined very soon. We will have it up probably by tomorrow on our social media. And the message is to the governor, keep the buildings closed and return us only when it's safe. Only when we reach those 3 conditions that we just called him about. So we want to do a poll for you. Yesterday we had about 1,000 people who said that they would turn out. Will you show up on August 19th to one of those actions? And I'm reading some good comments in the chat. There's a good question. Why should the districts who have low rates remain remote? What I've been saying, you're actually going to hear in just a minute from Mary, who's in one of those remote districts. We have to remember that the virus crosses the lines on the map. We have to remember that we have educators who live in Revere, for example, but who teach in a low incident district, and vice versa. We have to remember we have students in the METCO program coming from Boston where there's high incidences, and students of color, because of disinvestment in public health, have not had access to proper health care, and they are more at risk of contracting the virus. And they still, if they come to our schools and if they have the virus, they will bring it with them. The virus knows no boundaries, and it simply follows people wherever they go. And transmission rates are only just one of many factors that matter. So we have a good portion of people today who will participate, and a good portion who aren't sure. I know there's lots of factors. It's clearing your schedule, it's knowing more details. We will get you as many details as soon as possible, hopefully by midday tomorrow. So we hope to see you there. So I do want to turn it over now to Mary Grutchfield. She is going to tell you the story of what's happened in one of those low incident communities. She is the president of the Athol Teachers Association. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. As Mary said, I'm Mary Grutchfield, and I'm the president of the Athol Teachers Association. We represent two small towns, one that is extremely rural, and we've had very low rates in the area. I'm also a special education teacher of children K through 4. Just hours after Governor Baker released his fancy color-coded map showing that Athol was all good to go back in, full in to the schools because we were white, we had our first 2 cases in the school district, 2 cafeteria workers. And we might have possible community spread further. ATA had to push hard to get Superintendent Fernandez to agree to empty the building where they were working. And we continue to push hard to get the custodians the proper PPE in order to disinfect the schools. They sent them into the school and asked them to fog the school. They only had gloves and they only had masks, not N95 masks. They were never trained on how to use the foggers, and one of our custodians was soaked with the chlorine solution after he fogged. We're still pushing to have them quarantined. As Mary said, no community lives in a bubble. No community in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Even a community in a white or green zone can change in a second, as evidenced by what's going on in our little communities here. We need to have far better safety measures in place before we safely return to schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And I'm going to turn it over now to Michelle Gordon. She is an kindergarten teacher in Brookline, and she has been doing critical work within her own Environmental Health and Safety Committee in Brookline and with the MTA's Environmental Health and Safety Committee. She's going to lay it out for you what we are saying you have the right to expect. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Like Mary said, I'm a kindergarten teacher in Brookline, and I am also the chair of health and safety for the Brookline Educators Union. I'm going to give you a brief summary of the new health and safety document that MTA's Environmental Health and Safety Committee has put together, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we'll be using it locally in Brookline. Before I go into my summary, I do want to point out that until yesterday, Governor Baker had not come up with any public health benchmarks governing the opening, closing, or reopening of schools. And the state of Massachusetts has generally been using pretty comprehensive benchmarks to determine the phases of opening the economy, yet yesterday's single benchmark is far less restrictive than those have been. So let me highlight this document that should be in the chat right now or going into the chat. In this document, you will find specific benchmarks for training and real-time reporting, including daily compliance logs in each room and weekly infection reports by school, indoor air quality benchmarks with specific requirements around filtration, fresh air, humidity levels, and temperature, testing and contact tracing, including rapid testing and quarantine guidelines, PPE as per OSHA laws, cleaning and disinfecting benchmarks, following OSHA laws and establishing protocols, ensuring training and requiring minimum standards for hand sanitizer and sinks or washing stations, social distancing requirements, contingency plans, and whistleblower protections, And finally, accommodations for alternative work plans and the requirement that each building have a full-time nurse. In Brookline, our members have been loud and clear about wanting to know what we mean by safe. So this document will help us frame those conversations, as well as give us strong minimum health and safety standards at the bargaining table. Particularly important since at our school committee's meeting last night, it seemed as if the only benchmark determining safety was whether a room had the right filter and airflow. And that is very concerning to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And we continue to have, we have an incredible environmental health and safety committee. They have been meeting every week for weeks, sometimes twice a week, to put together all of these documents for you. So look, I'm continuing to read your concerns in the chat that school committees are either taking the wrong position or they're pushing you into unsafe conditions as educators, even without students. MTA was very clear 3 weeks ago when the board of directors took a position and we used the word refuse. We used the word, we refuse to go back into the buildings until it can be determined that they are safe. And you've seen Michelle just lay out, and this document lays out a set of standards, not one, not two, not in isolation of each other, but what it means to be safe. Some have tried to construe that statement as a refusal to work at all or a call of MTA to strike. It isn't a refusal to work. What we are saying is we will work virtually, but we won't go back into the buildings. And we've been working very carefully with our legal department. You are entitled to demand that health and safety concerns are addressed so that you're not putting yourself and others at risk of serious illness or even death. Those are your rights under the law. We have a law in Massachusetts, General Laws, Chapter 150E. That's the law that gives us the right to collectively bargain. There's a Section 9A. That's the law that prohibits us from what's called inducing, encouraging, or condoning a strike. But we believe that conditioning your return to in-person instruction and based on health and safety standards does not violate 9A, and that gives you flexibility to draw a line and hold it. And that feels scary. And it is scary. But I can promise you what I promised the group yesterday. We have 12 regional networks, county associations, educator of color networks, a budding ESP network. We got your back to take a hard line to say we refuse to go into the buildings and we will start virtually. And I can promise you, MTA's got your back. So next week after the 19th, if we're still in this position of uncertainty, we can do this. We can escalate our actions. We have petition language, for example, that you all can work together and sign that says you're demanding your rights to a healthy return. It's not over. We're still in this together as a state. And once we can actually get those positions finalized, then we can turn to the joyful work, the work that you all love to do, the work that's going to transform our model of what remote instruction looks like. But there's still danger. I'm going to turn it over to Bev Mieres, who very quickly is going to talk to you about how the commissioner is trying to replace us with computers. And we will not tolerate that either. Bev Mieres is our director of the Center for Ed Policy and Practice.
Apparently, while it is the work that all educators are engaged in every day, and the reason why we came into this profession, the Department of Education does not believe that educators have the knowledge, the skill, and the creativity to do a better job with remote learning than we were forced to do last spring when we had to implement it on an emergency basis without resources investment and the guidance was changing. And to that end, the department has struck a deal with a number of vendors to provide what I refer to as the lowest common denominator of online learning and calling it remote instruction. There are two models. One of them is essentially on a student by student basis, paying a cost from one of the two virtual schools that the Board of Education has authorized, and that's the Greenfield Commonwealth Virtual School or the TECA Virtual School. Those options, that option is whatever curriculum that those two institutions use. The staffing, the teachers in that program are employed by the two virtual schools. There is some role for educators, but it's undefined, and it appears to be in a support, not a control role in that situation. The second option is even more troubling because it is they've contracted with two vendors, the Florida Virtual School and Edgenuity, to provide a completely asynchronous option for students. They do not provide teachers. The curriculum is there, very admittedly, described as basic curriculum. And again, it's unclear what role the district educators will need to play. But that second option is really, I think, educators' biggest fear. Some of you have experience with the Edgenuity model in credit recovery programs that are used in your districts. The cost of that ranges from $400 to $600 per student per year. And the fear, I think, and I know a number of you have contacted us that your school committees are considering it. It's a cheap and lazy way to provide remote learning without meeting the needs of students, parents, and educators, and is incredibly troubling. Both of these represent a clear outsourcing of the work of educators in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Bev. It's worse than a cheap and dirty way, right? A cheap and quick way. It's another form of structural disinvestment in our communities of color and our low income communities, because those are the communities who already don't have enough resources to manage education in this pandemic. DESE wants to replace educators with computers, and we're not going to let that happen. I'm going to turn over to Murph Brown, a former MTA member, Black educator from the Springfield Education Association, who I am now proud to say is our Director of Training and Professional Learning. As a union member, we're here for you to figure out the practice, the craft of being in education. And Murph is going to tell you how we are going to support the redesign of learning over COVID.
Good morning, everyone. And just to piggyback just briefly on what Bev said is that I understand a few weeks ago, DESE asked educators to send in their intellectual property on what it was that you were doing for free. That's another slap in the face. But yet they're willing to pay millions of dollars for a remote learning series. Just think about that. So my role is to provide educators the best service that we can offer in terms of professional development. 2 weeks ago, educators shared over 1,500 ideas, tools, and instructional sites that you have been preparing for your children since school closed. TPL is organizing this information, and this information will be made available to members through creative PD opportunities that are member-driven. Educators are professional, and this is the moment to rewrite education because teachers know, and you're with our children every day, whether it's on-site or online. Educators know how to teach. We have proven that educators need to teach, and we're willing to do that while we are in a pandemic. But we know that being live with our children on site is what we desire the most. So we have the tools, we have the resources. You all proved that by populating a chat within 3 minutes of over 1,500 suggestions. So you already have what we need, okay? So what is not happening and what gets my blood boiling is that educators continue to be disrespected by the powers on high. Educators are being robbed of the time we need to curate the resources, the time that you all desire to collaborate, and the ability to support one another. Because the commissioner wants to spend money, millions of dollars, on a curriculum that you already know, you already have developed, you already know how to do it. And so ultimately, and I'm going to end with this because I'm going to be going off the wagon soon, because this is what's so important to me. MTA and the TPL staff respect the knowledge of our educators. Fact is, we gave our first virtual conference. It was member-led. You are the professionals. You teach us. You teach each other. We don't need a curriculum. We need to be respected, and we need to do what we know how to do. These are our babies. These are our children. We're not going to let anyone override what we know we have sweated through, we have educated ourselves on. We can do this, and we're going to do it. And we're going to do it together. And so the TPL, with your leadership, because you are the educators, you tell us what kind of workshops you want. So we will affirm what you know. We're going to get this up and running, and you all will do it, because that's what teachers do. We do it regardless. We will do it. MTA is here to support you. I'm new to this position, so I'm still an activist, but we will get it done. End of story.
Thank you, Murph. Sit with that for a minute. There's your power. Knowing what Murph just said is where your power lies. We not only know how to teach our students, we know how to keep them safe. And that's the message. When somebody challenges you with nonsense rhetoric about why won't the teachers go into the buildings because the nurses are and the frontline workers are, our response is, we have always had the obligation to keep our students out of harm's way while we are educating them. And we are keeping our students out of harm's way, and de facto, we are keeping their families out of harm's way. So let me leave you with a few thoughts. There is still a lot of work to do. MTA still needs to pull together our a cohort of special education teachers, of librarians, of art and music and phys ed teachers, so we can solve the problems that are unique to your field, of our vocational tech educators, of our paraprofessionals, because we have the answers. When the pandemic hit 100 years ago, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't computer technology. So the solutions to how we educate and reach our students came through the libraries and came through the communities. Today, we just jumped into technology as the solution, and we don't need to continue to rely exclusively on technology as the solution. Let me remind you that it was at the insistence of the MTA, the AFT, and the BTU that the commissioner defined remote learning as far beyond the use of technology. We can think outside of the box to figure out who to use to get our students' needs met besides the classroom teachers. We can rely on the bus drivers to help us with delivery. We can rely on the librarians and the cafeteria workers and the paraprofessional educators and the students and families themselves to be our partners in solving this problem. And we must demand that the state do their part in providing the resources. We will not ever go back to sick buildings. We will never go back to the remote learning of the spring. We will never go back to a curriculum that marginalized our girls, our students who identify as LGBTQ, our students of color, our students who live in poverty. We will not go back to a weaponized evaluation system, and we will not go back to the racial and class inequities in society that have come as a result of disinvestment in communities And there's certain things that we won't even move forward towards. We will not go forward to a model of cameras in the classroom. We will not go forward to a model of education where DESE and the districts transfer decision-making from the educator to the machine. We are only going forward with this campaign. We will continue to build our relationships with each other, with our students, with our families. We will continue to fight for a virtual start. We will continue to redesign COVID education and beyond so that it's connected, so that it's joyful, so that it's meaningful. And we will continue to win the schools and colleges that our communities now demand. So stay with us. We'll see you October 19th, and we will see you beyond until we win every single demand that needs to be won. Thanks, everybody.